Hi, everybody. Stefan Molyneux from Free Domain Radio. Hope you're doing well. So, Colin Flaherty, you may have heard the name floating around these interwebs. He is an award-winning writer. His work has been published in more than 1,000 places around the globe, including the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Boston Globe, Miami Herald, Washington Post, Bloomberg Businessweek, Time Magazine, and others. He is the author of the Amazon #1 bestseller, White Girl Bleed a Lot, and also Don't Make the Black Kids Angry. We'll put the links to those below. Thank you so much, Colin, for taking the time today.
Oh, it's great to be here. I'm a big fan of yours.
Thank you. So, an honest conversation about race. This is something that I have been encouraged to participate in my whole life. And it's hard not to get the feeling sometimes that it's a little bit of a trap. In other words, if your honest conversation about race doesn't fall along the sort of mainstream media narrative, which is that almost all the problems in the black community are the result of endless intergalactic white racism, well, then you've just got it wrong. So it's not really an invitation to a conversation so much as it is an invitation to a self-flagellation that I think arguably and statistically is not exactly helping the black community. So what is your approach? How did it come about? And what makes it different from what most people talk about, an honest conversation about race?
You know, when Eric Holder said we're a nation of cowards when it comes to race, I don't think a lot of people really understood what he meant, because what he meant was what you just said, which is you, Colin, have to be honest enough to admit that you are racist. And one of the biggest books in the education field is called Courageous Conversations. The same thing. You teacher, you white teacher, have to be honest enough to admit your racism has screwed up a generation of black students and created this enormous disparity. And so everything is topsy-turvy on this topic, when it comes to talking to race. That's why, I enjoy your stuff on it. And, we're just trying to be truth tellers out here, and without racism, without rancor, but also without apology.
Well, and I think that it could be said that one of the problems with society as a whole, and I would sort of argue more around the liberal media, is that there is a kind of racism against blacks. And the racism against blacks and whites as a whole is shielding people from facts. I mean, certainly the antidote to all forms of bigotry must be factual information, because bigotry is denial of the facts in preference of a personal narrative that's usually pejorative to some group. So surely, having an honest conversation about race, we must first bring facts to the table so that we can differentiate bigotry from empiricism.
I probably once a day I hear the expression racist facts. And, when I talk to people about this, I don't even talk that much about it. I just kind of say, did you see this? Did you read that? Did you hear about that? I don't try to explain it. I don't try to offer causes or solutions. I just say there's something really bad going on out there. And to me, when people really get into granular about, we got to explain this thing, it's like, that's usually a deflection, because then somebody wants to go back to 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So my whole thing is really demonstrating to people beyond any doubt, using video, using, whatever, that there's something really, really wrong and out of proportion with black violence and black crime in this country. And I also demonstrate how the reporters are ignoring, denying, condoning, excusing, encouraging, and even lying about it. And so, yeah, it's amazing. I mean, what's the expression? The bigotry of soft expectations. And, man, I see that every day. I'm just surprised more people aren't. I mean, when I see Hillary Clinton, there's Hillary just the other day. She said, white people have to learn how to listen to black people better. Okay, so I'm sitting here going, oh, okay, that's dumb. But if I were a black person sitting in the audience, I'd be saying, really? I need Hillary Clinton to stand up for me? Really? That's where we are now. I mean, I am just this helpless little waif waiting for the goddess of democratic politics, Hillary, to come along and take care of me. I mean, isn't it kind of ridiculous?
Well, and given the amount of dysfunction in certain sections of the black community in America, I would sort of argue that they may have slightly higher priorities than whether white people listen to them or not. And there sort of seems to be two layers that you work in terms of explicating the violence that's going on. And first, of course, which I think a lot of people are aware of, there is an enormous amount of violence within the black community, black on black, violence. And there's some level of comfort talking about that. Not that anybody likes to talk about it, but there's some level of accessibility to that information because that can be blamed on white racism. But the problem is, and I think this is where you do the work that is the most powerful, the problem is that when you start talking about black on white violence, well, that really gets dangerously close to the third rail of challenging the narrative. Because black on white violence, if it is, as you, I think, have sometimes referred to it, in epidemic proportions, that's tough to say, well, that's just the result of white racism. Because that, of course, if there's an epidemic of black on white violence, that may be some reason why whites can be a little jumpy.
I think everybody understands that violence is completely unacceptable for anybody with aspirations of living in a civilized society. That's why it's so troubling to see all this violence that is so easily shuffled off, so easily explained, so easily ignored. People even lie about it. And I don't think it's, to use maybe an academic expression, I don't think it's a sustainable model to have all this violence and people ignoring it.
So let's start delving into some of the facts that are not brought forward in the mainstream media. What are the major areas of crime and issues around criminality that you feel really deserve their day in the sun?
Well, there's so many things. I mean,
We've got time.
Yeah. Okay, so it's funny when I started writing my books, both times my publisher said, well, Colin, do you think we need more statistics in there? And I always say no, because the statistics are so far out of whack. White versus black crime versus, you compare black on white versus white on black. It's 10, 50, 100, 1,000 times difference. And so I don't know what the point is of having a long discussion with some liberal about whether this assault, black on white assault, is greater than white on black assault. Is it 9 times greater or 10 times? It's like totally out of proportion. And so I really focus on not the statistics, but I focus on the stories. I focus on the actual happenings. There's an enormous amount of black on senior violence out there, black on old people violence. There's an enormous amount of black on gay violence. And these reporters, when they look in the camera, they just keep looking at, and they keep doing these stories, and it's like they've never heard of this before. I'll tell you one thing these reporters don't get enough credit for: their dramatic skills. I mean, there are Oscar winners out there.
So what does the data say, the sort of government supplied data say about black on white violence and its relationship to white on black violence?
Okay, it's depending on where you live, depending on what crime you're talking about, 5, 10, 15, pick a number, 1,000 times greater, one than the other. But here's the thing: as bad as the data is, as wide as the gap is, the real numbers are worse. Because you talk about stitches for snitches, talk about witness intimidation, you talk about Bronx juries, where a black jury tends not to convict a black defendant. I document all this stuff in all my books. You talk about how black people do not report crime. There's a device called the shot spotter. It's an audio device you put on like telephone poles. So when they hear a gunshot, it goes to 911 immediately, and they can get cars there. Well, they put up a shot spotter in a black neighborhood in Oakland, California, and they figured out that 90% of the gunshots were not being reported. So the crime, I mean, we know that half the violent crime in America is not reported anyway, and that number is growing. But what else is growing are the number of people. The reason why they don't report it. People don't report it because they feel the cops won't do anything about it. I'll tell you something. I was out to dinner last night with some cops. Sometimes people, they drive up and down the Eastern Seaboard, and these cops were going by. They called me and they go, "Colin, we're in the neighborhood. Okay, let's go. Let's have dinner." So the one takeaway from talking to cops is cops. What keeps the cops up at night is they're worried that people like you and I don't have any idea how bad it is, what they see every day. So they're not worried about the numbers. They're worried about this unbelievable level of chaos and mayhem and violence and sometimes murder that they see all the time, that everybody's trying to just wish away.
Well, and you've talked about the degree to which the mainstream media is kind of feverishly working overtime to hide the level of black violence from the community as a whole. We can sort of speculate as to their motives, not that it's particularly relevant, but you've also pointed out that if you know someone who's like a crazy liberal, who just, at a dinner party, they just say the stuff that even the moderates are rolling their eyes at, that's average in the mainstream media. That's sort of the average template for...
That's your average reporter. Exactly.
Yeah, that's your average reporter. So how committed are they to this narrative of endlessly portraying black people as victims and white people as racist aggressors and suppressing any information to the contrary?
Well, they're just as committed as that guy at your Thanksgiving dinner table is into telling everybody that George McGovern should have been president in 1972. They're just totally shut down about it. I mean, in a lot of my books, I publish letters I get from reporters, and you can't imagine. I mean, they're just as nasty as you can imagine. They call me names. They say, I don't know this. I'm making it all up. People write columns saying I'm making it all up. A guy in Albany, New York writes these columns. I mean, I do a lot of stuff, just all these towns nobody's ever heard of. I don't even do the big towns anymore unless it's something really bad. I don't even do that much on Detroit, Chicago, Philly, Baltimore, unless it's really bad. I'll do Albany, Rochester, Syracuse, North Carolina, Peoria, Springfield. And even the reporters in these, I don't know what it is about these reporters that attracts them to this field, but I always think there's about, 25, 30, 35% of the people that are just totally locked out of learning about what this is all about. So I'm not overly worried about them, but I think the people in the middle, there's a lot of people that have had direct personal experience with black crime, black violence, whether on themselves, whether on a family member. And I want them to know that you're not imagining this. This didn't just happen to you. This is happening all over the country, and it's okay to talk about it. But I find, Stefan, a lot of people don't know how to talk about it. They generalize, they stereotype, they use hypothetical situations. We have so many facts out there. And so my whole thing is, look, just get a video, get a story, and say the most powerful thing you could say to a denier. Did you see this? That's all. Let them explain.
And what I find particularly frustrating about this is that, like all good people, I want to see all communities flourish and be peaceful and do well and have stable families and get educated and be successful. I think everybody wants that. And that was actually the trajectory of the black communities in America sort of post-Second World War up until about 1965. Not that, of course, that anything was perfect, but, black incomes were rising, the black family was relatively stable, you had illegitimacy at about 20% as opposed to the 73 or 74% that it's at now. You had lots of blacks coming into the middle class, getting better education and so on. And then in the 1960s, just things went kind of really haywire. And, arguably it's been a real challenge, a mounting challenge in the black community to try and get back to the kind of bedrock stability and launch pad that they had in the post-war period. And that's what's so frustrating to me, is looking at the what if or the could have been if different approaches had been taken.
There's a guy who writes for the Washington Post. I forget his name, but he wrote a book. Won the Pulitzer in 2009. And the gist of the book was black people have been in slavery since 1980. And this guy made documentaries. He's a big shot at the Washington Post. He left the Wall Street Journal in 2012, I think. He was covering the national election for the Wall Street Journal. And you could see him writing all these articles about the Tea Party people being, really nasty, racist people. This is the Wall Street Journal. So if it's that bad at the Wall Street Journal, what do you think the rest of the paper's like? And I try to stay away from the history thing, but what you said is so important because if you look on TV or movies, basically black people have been in chains and in slavery up until 10 minutes ago, and you hear about all these great examples of black families and black accomplishment from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and they're all shooed away. They're all, and they're marginalized when they were great accomplishments, and man, it's been nothing but a downward spiral since the '60s.
Well, and as far as the mainstream media goes, given that they're I'm tempted to say exclusively liberal or Democrat, but I guess we'll settle for overwhelmingly liberal. And they love diversity, except wherever they work, and then they don't want anyone not from the left. It's like that, and we want a monoculture of leftism preaching diversity towards everyone else. Different viewpoints are great, unless they conflict with my ideological worldview, in which case they're evil.
You know what's weird? Okay, so this is weird. So the Washington Post ran a story. This about 2 months ago. A Marine, a decorated Marine, was assaulted by a large group of black people in Washington, D.C. on video. So the Washington Post took a couple, this guy, believe it or not, if you go to Camp Pendleton or Camp Lejeune, I think in North Carolina, you can see a statue of this guy. Because he's that famous. So he's assaulted on video. Post does a story. Hundreds of readers went in there to say they didn't really believe this guy's story, even though it's on video. They didn't believe it because black people just don't go around attacking white people for no reason whatsoever. And so at some level, it's not just the reporters, right? I mean, there's a lot of people in denial and delusion about what's going on out there. And I don't know of any more powerful way to reach them than just to say, look, show these videos over and over, new ones constantly we're getting every day, and say, okay, you explain it. Tell me what's going on. Talk to a cop, talk to a bus driver, talk to a teacher.
Well, and I remember one of the things that was floating around some time back, which I know you've dealt with in your books, Colin, was this polar bear hunting, the knockout game, and so on. And there was this war of narratives that was going on. And the war was, this stuff keeps happening, and other people saying, isolated incident, doesn't happen, not part of any pattern. And there was this real, and then it just seemed to vanish. I guess the it's not a pattern narrative one. But I remember just thinking, okay, well, there do seem to be some significant statistical and video evidence of this particular practice, which is sort of black youths going and randomly punching white people for fun and games. And then it just vanished. And that was one of the first things where I went, okay, well, that's odd. That's odd. You've, of course, talked about this phenomenon quite a bit as well.
I wrote a book about it. I did a video, just one after another. A couple months ago, New Yorker magazine did a story about Trump. And they shoehorned me into it, and they said that I was the one promoting the knockout game. I had made it all up, and I convinced Fox News to come along into my little scheme, and they accused Trump of buying into it too. And then they said, we went to a college professor. So they quoted this college professor who said, I've been looking. I've never seen one example of the knockout game. It's a myth. If you define anything narrowly enough, you can define it out of existence, and that's what he was doing. But I define the knockout game as anybody beating the hell out of somebody for the hell of it. It's a black thing in this country. Many of the targets are white, Asian, gay, young, old, whatever. It happens all the time.
And it would be something that would be important to be aware of, because, of course, the lack of information about this, not only is it harming the black community, because this information needs to come out. If you have a community that's in agony, you really, you don't take heroin to deal with a toothache. You try and get the problem solved at some level. So it really harms the black community, but it also endangers other people who aren't necessarily aware of how dangerous certain neighborhoods can be.
I did exactly, and I think that's why when I first started writing about this stuff, I was writing mostly about media hypocrisy, how they, the enormous difference between what they said happened and what really happened using YouTube. But then people started writing me letters going, Colin, you're saving lives. A good example of where we didn't save a life, of what you're just talking about, was two months ago. The conductor of the Baltimore Symphony, a white woman, she said, I'm glad we had the riots because that helped white people listen to black people, because white people do not listen to black people. So I'm glad we got, they got our attention. So I did a video saying, what about this guy? Did he need to, and this guy was a singer in a choral group that sang with the symphony, sang for this conductor. He was a white guy. He moved his family into a black neighborhood because he had nothing but love in his heart for all of God's creatures. And he thought he wanted to go show the black people how white people have nothing but love for all black people, not knowing for a minute, not recognizing this enormous level of resentment, hostility, even hatred, often expressed in violence, black on white. He moved in. He died soon. He was killed in a robbery soon after. And he didn't know the stuff that we're talking about. He was one of these people that locked it out. A professor at Harvard calls it routine activity theory. A white person in a black neighborhood can routinely expect to be the victim of violence, like the way one judge compared it to putting a person in a lion's cage at the zoo. So there's a lot of people out there, the gentrification crowd, they put their lives in danger. I mean, I've had this experience myself. I was at a wedding a few years ago, and when I was living in San Diego, and I met somebody who used to be my next door neighbor. I mean, I moved in and they had moved out a month before. So we're going, oh yeah. It was kind of a nice neighborhood of San Diego called Kensington. I said, where'd you move to? He goes, I just moved to Golden Hill. Golden Hill is a black and dangerous neighborhood of San Diego. I said, why'd you do that? He goes, well, I want my kid to get some more diversification. I swear, I felt like grabbing him by the lapels and slapping him, saying, are you idiot? You have a family. You're putting them at risk. Of course, the punchline of the story is 6 months later, his wife is out jogging through their gentrified neighborhood at 5 a.m. and is almost killed by a group of black people. I don't really care, Stefan, if you or I do whatever we feel like doing, stupid things with our own lives, but when you start involving your family in your stupid plans, I will call people out on that.
Right. And it is, of course, extremely disempowering to the black community to say that all of their problems result from institutional, intransigent, unconscious, often white racism. That their entire opportunities and neighborhoods and quality of their relationships, stability of their marriages, educational and job opportunities are all controlled from outside by this nefarious, ghostly cabal of white racism. That does disempower blacks who were, as I said before, doing a lot better when they had more racism, actual racism to deal with in the post-war period, and they were doing much better because I think there's this overwhelming physics of white racism that black people are supposedly held back by that does paralyze and becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, you can't make it because white people hate you. Well, I guess you're not going to make it then if you truly believe that, and it becomes a self-feeding cycle of falsehoods, misrepresentation, resentment, impotence, followed by rage and often attack.
Stefan, I'm wondering at what point do all of us stop referring to this fictitious thing called a black community? Because I'm one of these people that, I don't even know what a community is. I look somebody when they're in front of me, I try to look them in the eye and take them as I find them. I want them to do the same for me. And this whole black community thing, it's really a collectivist impulse, right? And we see all the negative effects of collectivism, socialism, whatever you want to call it, in there. I mean, the idea that you're living in this kind of community and you're just sitting there waiting for some person like Hillary Clinton to come down and tap you on the head and give you a job and a life. God, how could that be more? How could that be more what a delusional impulse that is.
So we've talked a little bit about blacks and whites, but of course, the bichromatic rainbow of American race hysteria is not necessarily just confined to blacks and whites. You've talked about Philadelphia, Asian students in the public schools, and you had mentioned the sort of years of racial abuse at the hands of black students. I don't know if you recall this. It's always tough to ask authors. Yeah, perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit about how that played out.
Black on Asian violence is something that's happening all over the country. So let's talk about. I'll just go through a couple. In Philadelphia, I opened. This was a couple years ago. I wrote about it. Don't make the white girl bleed a lot. Opened up the newspaper. 13 Asian kids at South Philly High are going to the hospital one day, emergency room. Apparently, they were beating up themselves. Anybody who lives in this region knows South Philadelphia is a black neighborhood, gentrifying now. But South Philly is a black school. You look through all the coverage, and everybody's going, well, I can't figure out why all these Asian kids are being assaulted every day. Well, it was years of daily black on Asian violence at the kids. They finally went on strike, and there was finally the superintendent got involved, and she kind of whispered to a reporter. She said, the Asian kids are provoking the black people here. And she gave the Asian students a flyer, how to behave so you will not antagonize the black students. You move up to Rochester. 5 years ago, they start taking in Asian refugees from Nepal. The minute these 5,000 refugees got off the plane, they put up, of course, this happens all over the country. They take the refugees, Catholic Charities, put them in the middle of the ghetto, in the black neighborhood. As soon as they move in, the minute they move in, they are victims of harassment, taunting, threats, violence, murder. This went on for 5 years till a few months ago. The local Rochester newspaper did a story. They spent half the article kind of apologizing for the fact that, these Asians are under attack. And sorry to kind of mention this to everybody, but it's all black people doing nothing but attacking Asian people. This is in Rochester, another small town that is a center of black violence. In San Francisco, the black on Asian violence is so bad. They had the local newspaper was forced to call it San Francisco's dirty little secret. Black on Asian. Anybody with a business, some of the most beleaguered people in this country, Stefan, are the small shopkeepers in black neighborhoods, near black neighborhoods. They're Korean, they're Chinese, they're maybe from India or Pakistan. Oh, man, these guys are beleaguered by daily episodes of racial taunting, racial violence, racial threats. And robbery and murder. I mean, I document this a ton.
Well, and you may just think of the little, I think he was an Indian fellow who was roughed up by Michael Brown before the events of that day unfolded.
Perfect. You know that Michael Brown thing. There was one thing I haven't heard many people talk about. Do you remember? Can you think of another time in the history of American journalism when we had journalists, even on Fox News? Dana Perina said this on Fox News. She said, we should not have released the video of Michael Brown roughing up that guy. We had journalists all over America going, no, I don't think we should have released that video. Can you think of another? The only other example is when that reporter, I think it was in Virginia. Remember the reporter who shot his two former colleagues about a year ago? He did a manifesto. He gave it to the ABC affiliate in his hometown, and they haven't released that either. So it's like,
and they won't, because I assume it's a anti-white racialist manifesto, and therefore they won't release it.
Yeah, and it's exactly the same as with, like, we shouldn't have never have seen the Michael Brown video of him in that store that was so revealing.
But I mean, from my perspective, it's hard to miss why that video was released, because the cops were afraid of the escalating protests and aggressions and riots that were going on in the community. So they released the video to say, here's what happened right before. They had to counter the gentle giant narrative because that was going to put cops' lives in danger.
Now, here's the crazy thing. Did anybody care? No.
I think it gave people with remnants of objectivity something to make them stop this sort of general pitchforks and sort of going on in the media and in the press. It gave I say maybe a slight speed bump. Maybe it was a big truck with big wheels, but a little bit of a speed bump.
It took the Washington Post almost a year to report that the hands up, don't shoot narrative should get 4 Pinocchios in their Lie of the Year contest. But even so, long after that video came out, long after we knew everything about that, was everything they said, point for point, was the opposite of what they said. I mean, you have 100 staffers on Capitol Hill raising their hands in the don't shoot narrative. The Washington Post photographers can't get enough photos. And, I'm not asking everybody to inject race into every single story they do, but I am asking reporters, to ask one question of these clowns that spread these, okay, we'll call them false narratives. That's a polite word for saying lie. Spreading these false narratives. You say, really? Can you tell me more about that? Really? So Michael Brown was a victim. Really?
And it's funny,
these lies are so tissue thin, they evaporate.
Well, so tissue thin for people who are based on reason and evidence. For other people, it just, they hear the narrative and it plants in them. And it just flowers regardless of sort of the information that comes out afterwards. We saw that with Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. We've seen that with Freddie Gray. We've seen that with other things where the narrative sort of takes flight with full media participation. And, it's like that old statement that a lie can go halfway around the world while the truth is still getting its boots on.
But that's why, so I've written a couple of books. I write a lot of articles. I spend more time on YouTube now, and that's why I think probably you're doing so well as well. Man, every day somebody goes, Colin, did you see that new Stefan, video? So I go, oh, yeah, sure, I saw it. But that's why the video is so powerful, and why we can just keep saying to these people, like, can you explain this? Did you see this?
Bike Week. That's all I have to say. Black Bike Week. I wonder if you can help people step through that, because again, this is stuff that is going on that is very, very important and which people just don't have information about.
Okay, Black Bike Week happens down in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And it's not an organized thing. People just send out messages saying, hey, Memorial Day, let's head down to South Carolina. We're going to have this. And almost every year, it's a scenario of large-scale black mob violence, mayhem, chaos, directed at shopkeepers, directed at each other, directed at the locals. It's held at the same time as, usually held at Black Beach Week, which is in Miami Beach. And, this weekend is Black College Week in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Now, 2 years ago, enormous, they had 40,000 black people rampaging through Virginia Beach. Since then, and I call this racial profiling. Since then, on this weekend, the Virginia Beach police turned Virginia Beach into an armed camp, the same way they do in Miami Beach for Black Beach Week, the same way they do in Indianapolis for Black Expo. Enormous scenes of large-scale black mob violence. And it's funny, nobody wants to call it racial profiling, but it sure as heck is. And the interesting thing about Indianapolis, where they have this large-scale black mob violence during their so-called Black Expo, is a couple weeks after they have the Indianapolis 500. 500,000 people come to town. The worst thing that happens is maybe they get a DUI. Maybe somebody's a little rowdy in public. They put a few people in the drunk tank, kick them out later. And you compare that to what happens with Black Beach, with Black Expo in Indy, and the difference is enormous.
So they tried to ban motorcycle rallies in the city where Black Bike Week was occurring. The businesses, who obviously mostly like to sell stuff, boarded themselves up to try and sort of hide from the violence. The NAACP said that banning motorcycle rallies was racial discrimination and sued to reverse this ban. And the businesses, you write, that closed during Black Bike Week were found to be guilty of racial discrimination. And that, again, businesses, the only color that businesses fundamentally like is green. And if they can make money off a particular situation, they mostly will. If they're boarding up and fleeing, it's because they can't make money and they're going to lose either property or, maybe their bodily integrity in some form. And so there's this weird thing where there's this narrative that the businesses could make a fortune off Black Bike Week, but they just chose to board up and flee because they're that racist that they don't even want to make money.
Isn't that hard to believe what you just said? That's why I was so careful about documenting everything, always do the videos. They took them to court and they forced them to stay open. And they forced them to subject in Black Beach Week in Miami Beach, people are trashing restaurants, they're running out without paying the bill, they're attacking the wait staff. And I don't know any other way to describe it other than to say, there's really only one response to everything that you and I are talking about now. The response is white people do it too.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about that because white mass murderers and white rioting and all that. So you'd only focus on black violence because you're stepping over the giant, I guess, appropriately colored Everest of white violence and just focusing on this minuscule problem.
And I keep waiting, so you look, right, a couple of weeks before Black Bike Week in South Carolina, they actually they don't call it White Bike Week, but they could. They have some kind of run to the sun that ends up in Myrtle Beach. Nothing happens, just a couple of traffic tickets. That's it. No violence. Miami Beach does fine 51 weeks out of the year, except for that 1 week of Black Bike Week, Indianapolis. White people aren't doing this too. And that's the classic excuse. And there's too much evidence out there that's the only thing they can say. So that's what they have to say.
How is standardized testing racist? I was just watching one of your videos this morning getting ready for the interview, and you were talking about a school where the blacks are protesting because there is standardized testing, which apparently is bigoted.
Yeah, it's all, when Obama came in 7.5 years ago, one of the first things they did was they pretty much declared that if there's ever a disparity between white people and black people in schools, performance, discipline, behavior, there's only one reason for that. That is white racism. So they carried that over all the places. But the thing about Baltimore, what was weird, it was a week ago, 100 kids left class. They had a protest about they don't want to take these tests. But about in one of the videos, they kind of gave away the game because all of a sudden they have an adult talking on one of the videos, and the adult comes in and goes, you know what? We're here because this is the 1-year anniversary of the death of Freddie Gray, and Freddie Gray was let down by our educational system. So it's like, what? Where'd that come from? Freddie Gray was, it was ridiculous. We now know the story of Freddie Gray, that he was just a guy looking for, he was trying to win the lottery in the back of that paddy wagon. That's a racial term too, but anyway. It is.
Well, only if we assume that my ancestors and probably yours too were a race. But so when it comes to this foundational perspective, it usually comes from the left, which is that if there is any numerical discrepancy, it can only be the result of prejudice. Only and forever. And this, of course, shows up in race, it shows up in gender, it shows up in a wide variety of other areas. If there's any discrepancy between male and female income, it must be the result of institutionalized, patriarchal, evil, cisgender scum sexism on the part of men. And if there's any discrepancy in outcomes between particular ethnic groups, it must be the dominant ethnic group that is racist. And, despite the fact that East Asians in particular do much better in white societies than whites do. Apparently whites are just racist. This foundational belief, more blacks in prison must be racism. More blacks committing crimes must be racism. Fewer blacks graduating from high school must be racism. Fewer black families staying together must be that foundational delusion, and it is a delusion because it's saying that there are no other factors other than what white people are doing. White people are somehow getting in between black parents and forcing them to not get, like throwing their bodies in between like an Oreo to make sure that they don't get married. And this foundational thing seems to be relatively, like all ideology, seems to be relatively impervious to basic facts, that there are many, many other explanations to discrepancies in outcome other than this one white racism physics universe that the leftists seem to inhabit.
You know that you just described very well critical race theory. Critical race theory says black people are relentless victims of relentless white racism all the time, everywhere. That explains everything, especially why cops are always picking on black people for no reason whatsoever. And this, and the message, the idea now that I think the important idea is not that this thing exists or is stupid, which it is, but it's not a theory anymore. It's an industry. This is standard practice in grade schools, high schools, forget colleges where it's a religion. This is something that people teach in hundreds of school districts around the country. There's a guy named, he wrote the book Courageous Conversation, Dr. Glenn Robinson. That's the manual for this. That's the Bible for this. And the prescription is, listen, we need more black teachers. Let's get rid of the white teachers because racism is the cause of everything. And every once in a while, a parent or a teacher will come up to him at a seminar, and they go, "Well, Dr. Robinson, I kind of noticed, they're all very nervous about this. I kind of noticed that some of my black students are a little more rambunctious, maybe even violent." And in the book, he says, "That's the wrong question. The question is not why black students are more violent. The real question is, why have Americans been so violent and racist to black people for the last 400 years? If your kid comes home from school and your kid knows who Emmett Till is, but not Ronald Reagan, your kid is in a class of critical race theory presented as fact. This is the greatest lie of our generation, that black people are relentless victims. It's a lie, but it keeps getting repeated every day. I mean, what does every news story say when they present this? Every day we see this story, every paper, every news, somehow black people are victims. When all I can tell you is that the evidence, every bit of evidence, as you were just saying, is not just a lie, it's a damaging lie.
Well, it means that, and two, of course, and you're absolutely right to push back against this concept of the black community, like this is a monolith of everyone who's the same, because there's lots of different and often opposing threads of thought within black community. At the sort of the turn of the last century, after slavery was at least to some degree ended, there were these two major thoughts in black intellectuals, and one was let's try and work through the political system to sort of gain reparations, and the otherwise let's reject political solutions and just work to improve our own communities as much as humanly possible. And I think it's one of the great tragedies that the former won out in many ways over the latter. But there are blacks, of course, and lots of people of good conscience saying, even if there is huge white racism, let's say that, and it doesn't seem to be budging, because that's sort of the theory that no, it's a moving goalpost, right? No matter what you do, you're still a racist, because it's got this platonic ideal of institutional, which means you don't even have to manifest it in any conceivable way. It's still there.
As of yesterday, Hillary was talking about subconscious racism.
Right.
Sorry,
you don't even have to be aware of it yourself. It's sort of like a demonic possession that leaves you with no memory, but it's always on. And it means that it's more of a challenge for dysfunctional black communities to look and say, okay, you could, even if you accept the white racism argument, you could say, okay, we're dealing with white racism. White people are like evil Siberian tigers. You know that. Oh, did we just lose you? Are you back?
I'm here.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. So evil. White people are just like evil Siberian tigers. They're just going to maul blacks, and they're terrible. Okay, well then what you do is you say, okay, well what can we do given that there are these predators around? You build a fence, whatever it is, you sort of drive, whatever. And so even if we were to accept the sort of racism argument, it would not preclude things that could be improved within the black community. Like, I don't say there are wolves in the woods, therefore I can eat crap food and not exercise. I mean, you would still have things that you could reform. And sort of my big concern is by putting the focus on everything external, even if we accept that the external racism is real, which I don't think it is particularly anymore, it does preclude a lot of self-reflection, and it does preclude a lot of improvements that could occur within the black community. And of course, a lot of black leaders are saying exactly the same thing and saying, look, we have to focus on our own culture. Why do we have a culture that in many places in black communities venerates someone who shoots a cop as some sort of Star Wars style Rebel Alliance hero, and the cop is just always the evil oppressor, even though the cop is the first person who's usually called when there's a problem in the black community with violence? There is something in the culture that could be addressed that would make things better, even if we accept all the white racism arguments.
Thomas Sowell says a racist is any conservative winning an argument with a liberal. But so as white people, we sit here and examining our own hearts. We're trying to find that last molecule of racism that we can squeeze out, right? This is what white people do. But I will tell you that it's on the surface. If there's any racial resentment, hostility, and it's black on white, and we see it every day. I saw it yesterday in Washington, D.C. They had a bus full of real estate investors going through Southeast Washington, and some of the Black Lives Matter crowd stopped the bus with all their T-shirts, and they're saying, "This is a Black Lives Matter crowd. You're not coming into our neighborhood and stealing our homes." They very much made it a black on white thing. Spike Lee says this all the time. Just a couple months ago in Brooklyn, they had a New York City councilman, a couple of college professors, a couple of activists. They were talking about how their neighborhood is being gentrified and how awful that is. And the worst, they said, well, what's the worst thing that could happen to your neighborhood? Or and the guy goes, well, yesterday I saw a white couple with a kid in a stroller pushing them down my neighborhood. And this was unbelievably bad. And everybody in the audience was twittering and clapping. We don't really recognize this enormous amount of black on white hostility. Or if we do recognize it, we go, oh, well, it's justified. You know something? What is the message of South Africa today? We know that there's an enormous amount of racial hostility directed at white people there. But the world has turned its back on South Africa by saying, you deserved it. That's how. And so I'm not really involved in the South African thing, but there is a message there, because that's happening here too. When white people are victims of racial hostility or violence or taunting on some level, somebody is saying, explicitly or implicitly, you deserve that for 400 years of racism.
Yeah, no, I mean, we on my channel, we have a presentation, Truth About South Africa, and we've actually, as a community, the Freedom 8 Radio community, we've all chipped in and helped a white guy get out of South Africa, because he was just absolutely terrified for his life, just being outside of his sort of razor-walled compound. It was a hugely terrifying thing. But of course, that is not white-dominated racial imperialistic narrative feeding, and therefore, we move on and we step over the bodies, and there aren't even any bodies because it's not part of the narrative. And it's hard for me to avoid, Colin, this idea. I don't know if you can prove it empirically, but the Democrats rely on the black vote quite considerably. And this was back to LBJ in the 60s when he implemented the welfare state. Basically, he said, we're going to now own the black vote for 200 years because we're going to try and get these people dependent on...
Said that in a much more vulgar... The quote
yes,
was much
slightly
more,
more,
of course.
Right, slightly more vulgar term. But so the people who are in the newsrooms are on the left and want the Democrats in power. And it seems to me that they're more political activists than any kind of objective reporters, because the more they can tell the black victim, white racism narrative, the more that the blacks, I guess the theory is the more the blacks are going to vote for the Democrats, the more the Democrats are going to stay in power, which is why whenever there's an election cycle going on, you can be certain that some usually ginned up, white guy murders black baby kind of thing is going to go on, even though the reverse situations are generally ignored, because it gins up the sort of resentments of certain aspects of the black community, gets the sort of voting drive for Democrats. So they're really attempting to buy votes by crippling an entire community of capacities, significant capacities for advancement. And so it seems to me that it's more of the mainstream media has become more of a sort of pro-Democrat, anti-black political movement rather than any kind of objective reporting, because that's the only way that I can sort of fit in the general patterns into a cohesive whole.
I don't think it's possible to overstate the amount of panic in Democratic quarters that the black voters might not be as enthusiastic this time around. And so the Democratic politicians are lashing the black voters with all these stories, because if the black voters do not come out, it's all over for the Democrats. The other night on TV, Joy Reid, she's a black reporter for NBC, and she was saying, I think the panel was even shocked, and this is the first time I've ever heard this. She was saying the Democratic Party is a black party now. And everybody just sat there and said, yeah, well, I guess that's hard to disagree with, because it's true.
Well, and if you were, again, focused on empirical facts, you'd say, well, this has really been the case for quite some time.
Exactly.
The Democratic Party was, the KKK was an offshoot of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party regularly pushed back against Republican drive for equality throughout the 19th and early 20th century. Incredibly racist party in its history. And I would argue that people say, oh, well, that flipped in the 60s. It's like, well, I don't know that it actually, I think the methodology changed. I don't think that the fundamental racism in the Democratic Party fundamentally changed in any way, shape, or form. They just... So,
I'm sorry, it didn't change because pre-flip, the Democratic view of black people is that they were not capable of handling themselves. They were weak. They were bad people. Post-flip, you hear Hillary saying the same thing. It's like, I'm here to save you because you're not capable. You're weak. You're stupid. Don't worry. I've got it under control. I don't see any difference between those 2 points of view.
Yeah, I mean, the affirmative action argument is basically you can't compete, so we have to force people to hire you. And how on earth is that ever supposed to instill self-confidence in any community? And people say, and the argument, of course, that it is historical racism and slavery, that certainly has had effects, but we can look at other cultures throughout history that experienced huge amounts of negative environments. I mean, the Jews who fled Europe under Nazism, and they had been basically second class or third class or violently killed or discriminated against citizens in Europe for over 1,000 years. When the European Jews came to America, it took them 4 years to achieve income parity with whites. 4 years. And so even though, of course, there's anti-Semitism in white communities to some degree as well. So, it's getting hard, I think, especially after 2 or 3 generations of white soul searching and let's try and do the best. And the Democrats, who claim to have been in charge of the welfare, so to speak, to use the word in its double meaning, the welfare of black communities has been the responsibility of the Democrats that the blacks are voting for. And certainly now when we look at the crime rates, which had been going down for some time, whether it's the Ferguson effect or some other thing, I assume it is the Ferguson effect, the fact that the Democrats have been in charge of the black communities, and in many ways the black communities are getting worse and worse. And now in particular with the crime upspike that's happening, and with manufacturing jobs leaving and the ladder to the sort of lower to middle class vanishing, which Donald Trump claims to be addressing. if the Democrats have been in charge of the black vote, at some point, and I think that's happening now, the black leaders and the intelligent black voters are saying, how are we doing now that we've been trailing after the Democrats for a couple of generations? Sorry, long speech.
No, that was good.
Pretend there was a question in there somewhere.
I know exactly. That was good. That was very pointed. One of the reasons I don't do solutions to this thing is because the Democrats have been saying the same thing for 50 years, and it never works. So the only answer is, well, let's do more of the same thing. It didn't work. And so now you see these guys in these big cities, and everyone is like, you're coming up with the solution. No, we've already tried that 1,000 different times in 1,000 different places, and it doesn't work. And not one reporter is going to look at you and go, yeah, we already tried that. That doesn't work. But they just pretend like nothing has ever happened before. All this is going to work with this crazy Rube Goldberg scheme with lots of moving parts. And Colin, you don't have any solutions. I hear that every day. My solution used to be complicated. I used to say, knock it off. That was very complicated. I've since reduced it by 66%. So my solution is now behave. I got it down to one word. You mentioned something.
Now I've got Austin Power teeth in my head. But
that's what it was.
We'll cut that in when you say that.
Let me ask you this, Stefan. You mentioned two words that are an everyday fact of life that nobody ever talks about anymore. Affirmative action. This, just the other day, there was a story where the New York Times, the top editors, sent a memo out to their lower level editors saying, you will hire some black reporters or you will come in here and be judged for why you did not. And so the level of affirmative action and quotas on contracts and hiring all over the country, every level of government, every level, every shape of government is enormous. College admissions, enormous. The unfairness of it, enormous. The message of it, damaging. It's just part of our culture now. I mean, kids, if you have a white kid who wants to go to college, what about Asian kids? Good Lord, Asian kid wanting to go to the Ivy League. I don't know what you have to do to be an Asian kid to get into the Ivy League now, because the SATs don't matter. Playing violin doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is if you grew up in a poor neighborhood and you got a 3.5 in some crappy school. I mean, it's astonishing, some of these race-based decisions we're making so casually all the time, and everybody just now is just pretending that it's normal. So guess what? I'm here to say none of that's normal.
Well, and we've got a lot of European listeners who do look across the pond and the racial, well, I guess they're going to have their own issues down the road with what's going on in Europe and the migrants and so on. But for those who don't know, there are a lot of schools, higher education schools, universities, unis, as they're called in England, that will artificially inflate the SAT scores of blacks, somewhat tinker with the white scores, but significantly reduce Asian scores, because Asians
I mean, when you say that is hard. I mean, I would not blame anybody for looking at you and saying, Stefan, you're making that up. You're 100% lying.
We'll put the source in the low bar here.
No, I'm with you. No, I understand.
Just for the audience, for the audience who say that, just look in the low bar. We've got all the stats, we've done all the reporting on it. But go ahead.
No, isn't that hard to believe? You say it. I mean, it's like that can't be true. Of course, it is true.
And it is so destructive for blacks to do that. I mean, first of all, they graduated at far lower rates than whites and Asians. So they get into debt. They don't even graduate because they're not capable of performing at the level that the school requires. And secondly, those who do graduate, when a black person goes out into the marketplace with a degree from a university, the employer doesn't know if the black is as capable or is the result of affirmative action. And there's no objective way to know. In the past, a black comes out with a degree, you're like, hey, you are just the same as everybody else, so I've got no problem hiring you. But now it's really tough for employers because they don't know if the person got pushed through as a result of political correctness and doesn't have the same abilities. And so they're going to lean more towards hiring Asians, especially Asians who get those degrees, because, man, you got to levitate. You got to be able to do telekinesis. You can walk on water because you actually made it through a university as an Asian. You got in. I mean, so it's actually slanting people, I would assume, more towards hiring Asians, which we can sort of see in Google stats, as opposed to hiring blacks, which is really, really destructive. And I think the smartest blacks now are looking at this and saying, college is not that valuable to me because nobody knows if I got through based on my own ability or based upon political correctness, affirmative action, and, just sort of inflation of grades to hit the numbers. So it really has made university much less valuable for the smart and competent blacks, which again, Law of unintended consequences. How many times do we need to learn the
Yeah.
same lesson?
Here's the thing. So say you're a regular black person. Maybe you're a smart black person. You get into a college you don't belong in, Harvard, Princeton, whatever. What are your choices when you get there? You're going to study physics, math? No, you can't. I couldn't do that. Average people can't go there. You're the only one choice left. You are now studying black resentment in the black studies department. That's your only choice. So instead of going to a place where you could thrive and prosper and get a degree where you could learn something, all you're learning is, I mean, when you see all the people at Yale, all the black people at Yale, hundreds of them out doing Black Lives Matter, it's like, that's it. That's your thing. I mean, there's so much damage on this racial consciousness stuff, and I'm convinced it's really kind of a cancer.
Well, there are very specific delusions throughout history that lead to unbelievable conflict, and it is usually only after decades, sometimes longer, of unbelievable conflict that people do stuff like, hey, let's separate church and state because everybody fighting for control of the state for their own religious dogma is really, really destructive. And, maybe let's not have serfs. Let's have some sort of free market in labor because we're all starving to death. Like in the Middle Ages, 10 to 15% of the European population would starve to death because basically you had communism on the land, which produced about as much food as the kulaks under Stalin in Ukraine in the 1930s, where 10 million people died. So there are specific delusions that are usually inherited from history that produce incredible dysfunction, and for some reason, I may go to my grave not knowing why, but for some reason, people, maybe because they're addicts to delusion, they will only examine their core delusions after an unbelievable amount of suffering.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned England and people in Europe watching this. What time I spent in Europe, when I talk to people in Europe, Americans are very surprised to hear that the Europeans, you tell me if this is a correct observation, the Europeans often are they kind of look down on us for our racial problems. Like I was just listening to NPR this morning. They said Obama is unbelievably popular in England. He's unbelievably popular in Ireland. And they think that black people are really, really, oppressed here. And they're very kind of smug about it. I'm not sure why that is, but.
Well, I mean, everybody conflates all the violence in America is just assumed to be part of the society as a whole. They say, oh, gun violence is very, very huge and problematic in America. It's like, not among East Asians, it's not. And not among, white people in America have about the same murder rate as white people in Belgium, as white people all over the world. So what they do is they take the large amount of violence coming out of the black community and just conflate that to America and say, well, just American society as a whole is this. And of course, that's not even close to sort of factual.
I've written a lot about English and European tourists who come over here, especially New Orleans, and they all come over here and they believe this delusion that black people are nothing but victims of white racism. They get into New Orleans, they go into places they shouldn't go, they never come out. I mean, the amount of violence directed at these delusional white people from Europe is enormous in some places.
Lambs to the slaughter, as they say. Now, let's close off with something else that is talked about quite a bit. And it is one of these narratives that you've talked about in your videos and in your books that is hard to push back against no matter how many facts you have. And that is the degree to which it is racism in police, courts, prison systems, and so on that explains why blacks are so much more likely to end up in prison than whites or Asians or whatever. So can you just step people through some of the logic that can help challenge that narrative?
Yeah, okay, so that's the story, right? So there's an enormous amount of black people in prison, way out of proportion, and there's only one answer to that. White people do it too, but you don't get arrested. And so my attitude is, okay, if white people are getting away with all this crime, A, where are the victims? Where are the videos? Where are the 911 calls? Where are the police reports? Where are the witnesses? They don't exist. On the other hand, if there are black people in prison who do not belong there, who were unjustly convicted, well, let's get them out. That's a legal thing. And you know what? I actually did a story. That's like the biggest story I ever wrote. I did a story that got a black person out of prison. His name is
I
Kelvin
remember reading
Wiley.
about that.
You
This
know
was
what?
early in your career, right?
That wasn't a casual thing. It wasn't like 20 journalists chasing these. No, this was me going through trash cans, going to everywhere, finally saying, hey, that never happened and showing why. And so if there are innocent people in prison, let's get them out. That's a legal thing. That's not a political thing. But the fact is that, over and over around the country now, we're seeing that people who run this country believe that black people, Republicans believe it. Rand Paul, John Kasich, Chris Christie, others, they believe that black people are in prison for no reason whatsoever except for white racism. So that means black people are getting released from prison earlier than they should. And now we see these horrific crimes against old people, young people, white, Asian, and the person's record is always, longer than their arm. So there's a lot of really, not just bad ideas. These are now dangerous ideas that are out there.
Well, and there are ways to validate. People just wave this magic wand of racism and think they've answered something, which is sort of why it's religious in nature, or I guess astrology, mystical probably is a better way of putting it. Because what you can do is you can compare arrest records by race with complainants' identification of the perpetrators by race. And if people say, well, it's only 1 in 10 crimes, do they say it's a black person, but 3 in 10 times a black person is arrested, well, then there's a discrepancy which you'd need to explore. But of course, there's very few people who say they were mugged by a white guy, and then they go to the cops and say, a black guy mugged me. I mean, what would be the point? I mean, it would be such a giant waste of time and energy and effort, and would be pretty easy to figure out. And so that doesn't really happen. The race that is reported by the victim of crime, the ratio of that to arrests is very close. Also, of course, is the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is done, which asks people more informally and without, but, have you been the victim and what was the race and so on. And that matches the arrest records. And so there are ways of actually trying to figure out whether or not racism is causing cops to disproportionately
Hillary
arrest blacks.
Just the other day, Hillary and Bernie Sanders have used this too. Say black people and white people commit the same amount of crime. White people are arrested 4 times. Black people are arrested 4 times more often. That's all based on one story about pot smoking, and it's all based on one thing: self-reporting. So you go to a bunch of white people and say, "Do you smoke pot?" And you go to black people, "Do you smoke pot?" And they answer the question in the same amounts. Well, Johns Hopkins and other journals, they do reports on self-reporting, and they're very explicit. They say, if you want to know the one thing that throws off this self-reporting, the biggest indicator of deceit in self-reporting is whether the respondent is an African American. So there's only one. If you come across a survey, a test about this crime thing, and if they're not, especially on drugs, if they don't test for drugs, if it's all self-reporting, it's not worth anything. I know that was kind of convoluted, but it's actually
but
that's what Hillary and Bernie are talking about.
Yeah, there are other facts as well, which is which ethnicity is more likely to smoke openly in the street versus in their basement. That is the thing. And also, if I say to put out a survey which says, have you ever driven drunk? And there's a bunch of people write back and say, yes, it matters whether you do it every week or once in the last 20 years. I mean, have you ever smoked marijuana is not the question which would tease out racism. How often? How much? Do you do it in the open? Do you do it in your basement? And all of this is not taken into account.
So Johns Hopkins did a study where they tested self-reporting but they had the blood test. So they already knew the answer. And it turns out that black people lied 6 times more often about their drug use than white people. They said they used the same amount, about equal, but when you tested, 6 times more often. This study's been replicated many times. People always lie about stuff. You ask them about going to church. You go to church. Oh yeah. People lie about going to church. They followed people. They found out that 50% of the people were lying about how often they go to church, because if everybody was going to church, there'd be 1 million people in church, but nobody goes to church, but they say they do. Same with drugs.
I just got that scene from Jaws. I think we're going to need a bigger church. But all right, so I really, really appreciate the conversation, and I recommend that people read your work, and it's important stuff. We can't get any solutions unless we have an accurate perception of the facts. And this, everybody wants the black community to do better, but we can't do it by pretending that they don't have problems as a collective, to use that. They don't have problems that they do have. And we need to
can't do
start,
it.
if you want to get out of the woods, you at least need to know where you are to begin with.
And we cannot do it if, as is happening today, we stay silent when black people are looking at us and going, Colin, Stefan, you're the problem. Your racism is the problem. White racism is, by the way, all that stuff's off the table now. All the family, income, health care, schooling, all off the table. It's all white racism. My guess is most people are not aware of how embedded that is now.
Right. So we'll put links to your books below, White Girl Bleed a Lot and Don't Make the Black Kids Angry. And I know that that's just a sampling. You've got blogs and articles and videos and so on. Really appreciate the work that you're doing. Appreciate the time that you've taken with us today. And I hope we can talk again.
Stefan, it has been an honor to be here with you, and all the best to you in the future.
Thank you.